Okay, so we're just about to finish up this idea that Matthew is pro-Jewish, pro-Gentile mission, but also somewhat anti-Jewish. And we already talked about the way that Jesus is depicted as rather giving a very harsh criticism to the Pharisees in the Gospel of Matthew. What's interesting is it's a little bit ambivalent because you notice at the very beginning of the chapter, it says, "Then Jesus said to the crowds," the chapter 23, and his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. Therefore, do whatever they teach you and follow it. But do not do as they do, for they do not practice what they teach." That's very interesting. So, are you supposed to overthrow the Pharisees and reject them and bring your new leaders in? No, you're not. You're supposed to honor them. They do have authority. They sit on the seat of Moses. So Matthew very much honors the Jewish traditions here. He doesn't see them as in any way superseded or passed by. But he does have accountability. That is, you should teach, do whatever they teach you, but don't do as they do. So again, here's this issue of orthopraxy, that he's seeing them as not having properly done the right thing, followed the commandments of God in a way that they now are hypocrites. And he calls them that. Again, this is a very prophetic critique, and we'll look at the chapter in more detail in class. But so we get this very strong, this very harsh criticism here. And here you can see that Matthew, in Matthew's community, in the time Matthew's written, in the late 80s, is in a tense relationship with other Jews, because there's clearly some kind of name-calling and critique going back and forth. There's that we have the right way of being Jewish and you don't. Not that that you should not be Jewish, but that there's a higher way, there's a better way. So we can kind of see it as internal to the community. In the same way as today, if you think about Christian tradition, or Christian communities, and the way that they very much disagree with each other about what is the right way to be a Christian. And I think that that is a similar kind of example of what you have here. Notice also the parable of the tenants in chapter 21, where Matthew actively, I think if you used Herzog, there's a way to read this text about the tenants that is not about Jews. But what's happened is Matthew has actually made it about the rejection of Jesus. And if you look at verse 43, "Therefore I tell you, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to the people that produces the fruits of the kingdom." So here's a very interesting problem, because once you get the Christians saying we are separate from Jews, we are the true Israel. Again, I don't think that's what you have here. I think you have we're the new Israel, the better, not new Israel, sorry. We have a better way of being righteous. Christ calls us to a higher righteousness. So there's in some ways, it's like a reform movement, a call to a return to what the tradition really stands for. And there were other reform movements in this time. But what we have here is when we link this idea that that they reject Jesus, and they link that to the parables. Matthew links that to the parable of the wicked tenants, and then says, as Jesus says, the kingdom of God will be taken away from you and given to people that produce fruit. Then you got something very interesting, because you have a text that can be used later for an argument of supersession. That is, we Christians are not Jews, and you failed, and we're taking over. But of course, again, this is an internal Jewish debate in the time of Matthew, and yet what happens in tradition is it gets read as Christians versus Jews, and that's the way Jesus saw it was going to happen. And it says the chief priests and the Pharisees knew they were talking about him and they wanted to arrest him. So this is very much used as a plot device, right? Where Jesus basically says to them, you better do the right thing or we're going to replace you, right? Meaning that the righteous will replace the unrighteous. The righteous Jews will replace the unrighteous Jews. That's different than saying the Christians will replace the Jews. I hope you can see that. We'll talk about that a little bit more this week. But again, so Jesus is ambivalently anti-Jewish, but there are seeds here. There's seeds here that can later be used when you get a distinct group between Christians and Jews. You can later use these seeds in order to be able to say, well, even Jesus was critical of Judaism, right? But I want to remind you of one more issue around this kind of anti-Jewish Matthew is that there is an emphasis throughout the Gospel of Matthew on Jesus is Lord. That is his title. He is Lord in Matthew. And so therefore there is a way in which lines are beginning to be drawn between groups based around Jesus, that this community very much does see its interpretation of Jesus as central to who it is and how it's going to live as a community in the world, that the Christ matters to them, that Jesus is the Christ matters to them. However, there's some interesting features about the Lord business. For example, in Mark, everybody calls Jesus a teacher. The opponents do, the believers do, the disciples do, people who fail do. Only the afflicted, it's interesting, only the afflicted call Jesus Lord. Everybody else calls Jesus a teacher. But in Matthew, it's different. That is, outsiders and opponents call Jesus a teacher. So the outsiders recognize that Jesus is a teacher. But the disciples and those come in faith, except Judas, by the way, in terms of the disciples, they all call Jesus Lord. So remember, the Canaanite woman calls Jesus Lord. So in some ways, characters already in the story know who Jesus is and they call him Lord. That is, they already recognize his kingship, his prominence as this Christ figure. And so he is a teacher, but he's a teacher as also the Christ. And that's very important because it's the outsiders that call him just teacher. So that's a very different aspect of the Gospel of Matthew, is that they very much have upped the ante in terms of how they understand Jesus, and although he's still a teacher, he's also has this title, Lord, for the insiders. That also makes the text we looked at already quite ironic. That is Matthew 7, then, when he says, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom, but only those who do the will of my Father. So again, we come back around to the idea of Matthew being the gospel of the church, because Matthew is very much instructing insiders, not just saying who those outsiders are, but saying to the insiders, don't think that you're in if you know who Jesus is. Because if you don't do justice and mercy, if you don't live out the obedience to the Torah, then it doesn't make any difference. It's really about how you live. And in that way, the borders between in and out in this community, who belongs, who's going to inherit the kingdom of heaven, are not being drawn between Jews and Gentiles. Because remember, it's a Jewish and a Gentile gospel, both. Okay? Matthew rather slices very hard along a different line. He slices insider and outsider in the teachings across the line of orthopraxy, right? And therefore, that can cross the line of Jew and Gentile. There can be righteous Gentiles and righteous Jews. And there can be unrighteous Gentiles and unrighteous Jews. And there, again, it's somewhat similar to this ambivalent third space that Paul is creating, even though Matthew has a very different view on the issue of Torah obedience. Okay? So it's a very interesting gospel that is very different than the Gospel of Matthew, and as we'll see, is very different than the Gospel of John and Luke. So let's go to the next slide. To sum up here, what we really see with the Gospel of Matthew is a view of what I would call Christian Jews. So they're not Christians, they're not Jewish Christians, and they're not only Christians. They're Christian Jews. In other words, Jew is the primary noun, the primary descriptor. They're Jewish. But they're Christ-following Jews, which is a particular thing in this period. What we see in the Gospel of Matthew are Christian Jews in a post-70 world, that is, on the other side of the destruction of the temple and the destruction of Jerusalem. And the questions they're pondering, like, why do we write Gospels? We write Gospels, we tell Jesus stories in order to answer the questions of our day, think about the issues of our day. The questions they're pondering are, what does Torah living look like in a world with no temple, priesthood, or centralized leadership? This is the same question that other Jews are asking themselves, but the Christian Jews answer it in a particular way, or at least Matthew's Christian Jews. John's Christian Jews answer it in a different way, and that's very important. We'll get there when the time comes. But they're pondering, what does Torah living look like? And they have a very particular answer, and that is, the Torah doesn't loosen or lessen or lighten up so you can get along with Gentiles. The Torah actually calls us to a greater purpose, to a better way of living. And it's not easy. It's radical. It's hard. You have to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So that's not easy. It's easy to love people who love you, but less easy to love your enemies. And the second question that this gospel ponders is, what is the relationship between Jews and Gentiles? Remember that the Gentiles in the time of Matthew's community are the enemy, that is, they're Romans. But the Gentiles are also their neighbors. They very much live in a world that is not predominantly Gentile. So how are we going to live with our enemies, our neighbors? The Gentiles are their reality. That's their reality they have to live with. So it's like a minority community living in a dominant world. You can't afford to not think about how you're going to respond and interact with the majority because you're a minority group. But also then, what is the relationship between Jews and Gentiles? When Gentiles are enemies, neighbors, are our reality, but they're also us. That is, there are Gentiles among us in our community. And who are we going to be? How are we going to work out what it means to live? And so the emergence of this idea of orthopraxy, in some ways, is, again, a way, it's kind of a universalizing move in a very particular Jewish way. That is, it's this idea that if we all keep God's, the broad story of God's Torah, that is, of God's justice and mercy and love and forgiveness as the dominant thing, we can continue to be who we are, right, in the particulars, but we're called to this higher calling, and that in some ways apparently allows the Jew-Gentile piece to reduce in terms of how much it makes sense of the world. So there are other questions we could ask about Matthew. We'll talk in class about the question of empire, but this is a demonstration of the way that we can see using the literary features of Matthew to understand and to make an argument for Matthew as a whole. I think that I've got a couple more slides. Let's see. Oh, just one last, and that is that when we get to class this week, probably Thursday, we're also going to talk about the problem of Christian anti-Semitism and the way that the Gospel of Matthew, and we'll see the Gospel of John, come to be used in the tradition in ways that I would say, that I would quote the Christopher Stendhal, who says in the article we read about Romans, how can you tell the Christian story without bearing false witness against our neighbors? And here you see the famous picture of the boy from the Krakow ghetto, who is this Jewish boy during the Holocaust, who is being depicted by this artist Samuel Bach as on a cross, right? He's carrying a cross. He's crucified. So he's a Jew who's crucified, but he's being crucified, of course, in Nazi Germany, and often with Christian complicity, if not totally Christian participation. We can talk a little bit about that. But I think it's an interesting question. We talk about the anti-Judaism in Matthew, and yet Matthew is also totally Jewish. We have to ask the question, how to tell the Christian story without bearing false witness against our neighbors? Perhaps that's a very important story, given that important question, given that all this week during Holy Week, we've been hearing the Gospels told in a way that tells those stories of Jewish complicity in the death of Jesus, not necessarily with a lot of interpretation. So what does that mean? How do Christians think about that problem? See you in class.